Welcome to the Sleep of Valor. Tonight's story is about Sir William Marshal, the greatest knight who ever lived. Prologue: Lamps in the Hall. The night gathers, and with it the long corridors of memory stretch before us. Imagine the stone ribs of a great hall, the soot-stained beams, the slow flicker of torchlight on old shields. Somewhere a dog sighs. Outside, wind worries the banners. We are not here for trumpets or for clamor. We are here for something quieter, the steady pulse of a life lived in loyalty. There's a name that moves like a lantern through these shadows: William Marshal. He was not born to certainty. He was the younger son of a lesser lord, offered once as a hostage, nearly extinguished before his story began. And yet the centuries remember him with a kind of reverence. Not because he seized crowns, but because he preserved them. Not because he broke oaths, but because he kept them when keeping them cost the most. The age that formed him was iron and smoke. Kings rose and fell, charters were sealed and broken, castles changed hands as easily as winter clouds. In such a world, survival often belonged to the ruthless. But William's endurance came from a different alloy. He learned patience where others learned panic, mercy where others practiced spite, and a kind of unshowy courage that did not need songs to survive. Tonight, let the clatter of history soften into a lullaby. Let the clang of steel turn rhythmic like rain upon a roof. We will follow William from the fear of his childhood to the thunder of the tournament fields, from the solemn roads of pilgrimage to the councils of queens and kings, from the smoke of battle at Lincoln to the candlelit stillness of his final vigil. We will walk slowly. We will breathe between sentences. We will let the story carry us like a gentle tide toward rest. Understand this at the threshold: greatness is not always a shout. Sometimes it is the hand that does not tremble, the word that is not broken, the step that does not turn aside when the path narrows. William Marshal's life was such a step. No miracle changed him, practice and pain did. No vision crowned him, duty did. And if he is called the greatest knight, it is because he learned to be faithful when the world rewarded faithlessness. So find your place by the low fire. Loosen the day from your shoulders. The night is long enough for a tale, and the tale is gentle enough for sleep. When you are ready, childhood in siege. The story of William Marshal does not begin with triumph. It begins with terror. A boy, scarcely old enough to understand the weight of crowns and swords, was thrown into the furnace of politics before he even knew the shape of a shield. He was born around 1146, in the reign of King Stephen of England, during what history remembers as the Anarchy, a civil war between Stephen and Empress Matilda. England was a land divided, loyalty torn into threads, castles under siege, towns burned, oaths shifting like sand. For many, this was an age of ruin. For William, it was simply the world into which he opened his eyes. His father, John Marshal, was a hardened man of war, shrewd and unyielding, playing his loyalties between rival factions to preserve his power. In 1152, when William was still a small child, John found himself besieged in his castle of Newbury. King Stephen himself stood outside the walls, his banners snapping in the cold wind, demanding surrender. The stakes were not only stone and mortar, the price of defiance was blood. In the grim negotiations that followed, Stephen demanded a hostage to guarantee John Marshal's word. John agreed, and the hostage he offered was his own son, young William. Imagine it. A boy no more than 5 years old, led out to the enemy camp, surrounded by iron and hostile eyes. Hostages were not symbolic in those days. They were flesh and blood promises, collateral for the honor or treachery of their kin. If John broke his word, William would die. Stephen kept the boy close. Chroniclers tell us that the king even held William in his arms, cradling the child on his lap, charmed by his innocence. Yet when John Marshal broke his oath, slipping away under the cover of night to reinforce his stronghold, the king's mood darkened. "By the glory of God," Stephen is said to have cried, "he has played me false, even though I held his son as surety." William's life now hung by a thread. Advisors urged Stephen to execute the child at once. Some even suggested stringing the boy up in view of the castle walls to force John Marshal's surrender. What a cruel weight for a child to bear, to be the pawn in his father's gamble, yet fate spared him. One tale recounts that Stephen ordered the boy placed beneath the walls, threatening to hang. But Stephen did not kill the boy. Whether out of mercy, amusement, or a moment of compassion, he spared William's life. Chroniclers say the king even laughed at the child's playfulness, remarking that such a lively hostage was too precious to waste. Thus the boy survived the siege, carried through fire and fear, marked forever by the knowledge that his life had once balanced on the whim of kings. This was the crucible that shaped him. Most children learn patience at their mother's knee. William learned it staring at the ropes meant for his neck. Most children learn courage chasing games in the fields. William learned it in the cold silence of a camp, where every man wondered whether he would see the next sunrise. That brush with death became a seed, planted deep in him. It taught him something no swordmaster could, that life is fragile, and honor is often a mask for ambition. It taught him that survival was not a given. It had to be earned, guarded, and carried like a shield. And yet, paradoxically, it gave him freedom. For the boy who has faced death and laughed, who has seen the noose and still drawn breath, fear holds less sway in later years. William would grow into a knight who rode with calm in the face of danger, who smiled in the press of combat, who lived with a serenity that unnerved his enemies. He had already been sentenced once. Every day thereafter was a reprieve. The siege of Newbury did not make him a knight. It made him something rarer, a survivor with nothing to lose but his word, and that word, in time, would become more valuable than any crown. The child who should have died in Stephen's camp would go on to serve 4 kings, to hold a realm together, and to be remembered as the greatest knight who ever lived. But it began here, in fear, in fire, in the laughter of a king who chose not to kill him. Tournaments and honor. Childhood had taught William Marshal how fragile life could be, but youth gave him fire and a hunger to prove himself in a world where steel, not lineage, decided reputation. By the time he came of age, England and France were alive with the clamor of tournaments, those sprawling, violent spectacles where knights sought both glory and gold. Forget the sanitized jousts we imagine today, with painted lances and blunted tips. In William's age, tournaments were small wars. Fields became battlegrounds. Hundreds of armored men charged in vast melees, lances shattering, swords biting, horses crashing against one another. Men were captured and ransomed, some were killed. Victory meant not only fame, but wealth. Horses, armor, prisoners who could be traded for coin. It was in this brutal theater that, firmly, William was not reckless. That was his genius. Where others sought quick glory and desperate charges, he calculated. Where others fought until exhaustion broke them, he paced himself, conserving strength for the decisive strike. He read the tilt of an opponent's lance, the tremor of a horse's stride, the narrowing of a knight's eyes. He knew when to thrust, when to feint, when to wait. Soon he was famous. Knights feared facing him, yet respected him. Ladies in the stands whispered his name. Lords watched closely, knowing that this man could one day be a valuable ally. Chroniclers say he fought in as many as 500 tournaments in his career, a number so astonishing that it became legend. But it was not victory alone that elevated him. It was mercy. William knew when to strike, but also when to spare. Captured knights were released with dignity. Enemies bested in the lists were treated not with cruelty, but with respect. This practice did more than win him coin. It won him loyalty, admiration, even love. Defeat under William Marshal was an honor, not a humiliation. Picture the scene. A wide meadow outside a French town. Dawn mist clings to the grass. Trumpets blare. The ground quakes with the thunder of hooves. Banners ripple like a sea of color. Into this storm rides William, calm, steady, lance poised like an arrow of fate. The charge crashes, splinters fly, dust rises, and when it clears, William is still mounted, his opponent unhorsed, his name shouted by the crowd. It was here that he learned lessons no court could teach. Strategy, patience, endurance, these were sharpened not by study, but by sweat and bruises. He became a commander of men, a leader who could anticipate not just the swing of one sword, but the momentum of hundreds. And with every tournament, his purse grew heavier. Horses, armor, ransoms, wealth poured in. But William did not squander it on vanity. He reinvested it in loyalty, rewarding squires, equipping men, ensuring that those who rode with him shared in his fortune. Knights spoke of his generosity, saying that to serve William Marshal was to be assured of honor and fair treatment. This was the foundation of his greatness, not merely skill, but the ability to bind men to him with trust. For in an age where betrayal was common, William's word was iron. Yet tournaments were more than training grounds. They were gateways to power. His fame carried. William entered tournaments a knight of fortune. He left them a legend. He had learned that honor was not in crushing one's enemy, but in lifting him with dignity. He had learned that wealth was not hoarded, but shared. And he had learned that patience in the saddle could win more than reckless valor. The boy, once abandoned at Newbury, was now sought after by princes. His lance was not only a weapon, it was a key, opening doors to the corridors of power. But power brings peril. The tournament fields had forged him, the royal courts would test him. And William Marshal, the greatest knight of the lists, would soon learn that loyalty to a crown was more dangerous than loyalty to a banner on the field. By the time William Marshal's name rang across France, it had reached ears that mattered most, those within the Plantagenet court. His fame was not confined to tournament fields. It traveled in the mouths of messengers, the songs of troubadours, the whispers of nobles. And so it was that William was summoned to serve Henry the young king, eldest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. The young king was crowned in his father's lifetime, a rare practice meant to secure the succession, yet it left the boy in a peculiar position. He wore the crown, but wielded no power. He was king in ceremony, but not in authority. Imagine the frustration. Parades, processions, and honors, yet no true control over the fate of the realm. A gilded crown that was also a cage. Into this discontent stepped William Marshal. His official role was tutor-in-arms, but he became something far more. A guide, a companion, a steady hand on the reins of a restless spirit. William taught Henry more than swordplay. He taught composure, patience, and the dignity of honor. He reminded the prince that true power lay not in spectacle, but in the keeping of one's word. And yet, Henry loved spectacle. Tournaments thrilled him, and with William at his side, his victories multiplied. Chroniclers recall dazzling scenes. The young king leading charges, William riding close, the two of them cutting through the melee like twin stars. Knights fell before them, ladies cheered from balconies, and the Plantagenet name gleamed brighter with each victory. Together, they became icons.
For William, the sting was bitter. He had given his loyalty freely, without deceit, but how could one defend against lies? To protest too strongly would only feed suspicion, and so, with quiet dignity, he withdrew. Exile was his shield against slander. He left the young king's side not because he wavered in loyalty, but because loyalty sometimes meant retreat. Yet even in distance, his bond remained, and when Henry rebelled against his father, William's name was still remembered with respect. But fate was cruel. In 1183, the young king fell ill, struck by fever in the heart of France. As death closed in, he called for William Marshal. The scene was sorrowful. A prince barely in the fullness of life, wasted by illness, his crown meaningless before the final horizon. To William he offered his cloak, embroidered with the cross, and begged one last favor. Take this to Jerusalem. Fulfill the vow I could not keep. Carry me where I cannot go. William swore it. And as the young king breathed his last, the knight took upon himself not only grief, but a pilgrimage. Firmly, he journeyed east, carrying that cloak to the Holy Land. He fought not for glory, nor for ransom, nor for fame, but for a promise whispered by a dying friend. He rode through deserts, walked the streets of Jerusalem, and laid the cloak where prayers rose like incense. In that act, he fulfilled the young king's vow, and with it proved the depth of his loyalty. Chroniclers later said that this pilgrimage tempered William more than any tournament ever could. He returned not as a knight hungry for fame, but as a man who had seen mortality, who had carried sorrow across continents, who understood that duty was greater than ambition. The young king was gone, but his memory rode with William for the rest of his days. And in every act of loyalty that followed, in every calm word to a tempestuous king, in every patient counsel offered to a realm in turmoil, one could trace the echo of that vow, a promise kept beyond death. The young king's cloak lay in Jerusalem, but his spirit walked forever beside William Marshal. The Crusade and Return. The road to the east stretched farther than William Marshal had ever ridden. For most knights, a crusade was an adventure, a chance for glory, plunder, or absolution. For William, it was none of these. It was grief made flesh, a promise stitched into fabric, the final wish of the prince he had once guarded. In his saddlebag, wrapped with reverence, lay the cloak of Henry the young king. To carry a vow across continents is no small burden. The journey was perilous. Treacherous seas, blistering deserts, the constant threat of ambush. Yet William pressed onward, every step a prayer, every mile a remembrance. He was not chasing fame. He was fulfilling loyalty that death itself could not sever.
Imagine him entering Jerusalem for the first time. The streets crowded with pilgrims, the air thick with incense and dust, merchants shouting, monks chanting, banners of many nations fluttering in the hot wind. At the center, the Holy Sepulchre, its stones worn smooth by centuries of hands, its silence pierced only by whispered prayers. William approached not as conqueror, but as penitent. Chroniclers differ on whether he fought in the east. Some claim he tested his sword against the infidels, joining the fray of battle under the blazing sun. Others suggest he walked more as a pilgrim, restraining his blade, seeking absolution rather than blood. The truth may lie somewhere between. What mattered was not what he won, but what he carried and laid down. In Jerusalem, William fulfilled the vow. He offered the young king's cloak at the holy places, surrendering it as both tribute and prayer. The act was quiet, unnoticed by the world at large, but monumental in its meaning. A prince's broken promise had been mended. A friendship had been honored beyond the grave. This pilgrimage changed him. He had always been steady, but now he was tempered like steel drawn from fire and plunged into water. The East gave him perspective. He had seen empires rise and falter, seen men travel thousands of miles for faith, seen death waiting in every shadow. Glory seemed less urgent now. Duty, however, gleamed brighter than ever. On his return to Europe, the world recognized something in him that had not been there before. He was not merely a tournament champion, not merely a knight of fortune. He was a man who had walked with grief, carried it across deserts, and returned with dignity unbroken. That kind of loyalty, that kind of patience could not be ignored. And one who did not ignore it was Eleanor of Aquitaine. The great queen, mother of kings, saw in William Marshal a rare constancy. He was a man who did not bend in the storm of politics, who did not seize what was not his, who carried his honor like a shield. She drew him into her circle, trusted him, and gave him responsibilities that would elevate him higher than ever before. It was through Eleanor that William's life changed forever. She arranged his marriage to Isabel de Clare, heiress of vast lands in Ireland and Wales. Overnight, William transformed from a knight dependent on ransoms and patronage into one of the wealthiest magnates in the realm. Castles, estates, and power were now his to command. But true to his nature,
the crusade had not made him a saint. It had made him something rarer. A man who understood the balance of power and humility, of grief and endurance, of honor and survival. He had carried a prince's vow across the world and returned carrying the trust of a queen. Ahead lay greater trials, serving Richard the Lionheart, enduring the storms of John's reign and becoming the regent of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. But the William who returned from Jerusalem was ready. He had faced distance, exile, and mortality itself. There was little left that could shake him. From this point forward, his story was no longer just about survival. It was about guardianship. He would not only serve crowns, he would hold kingdoms together. Some figures in history shine so brightly that even centuries later their presence feels immediate. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of them. She was Queen of France, Queen of England, Duchess of Aquitaine, mother of 10 children, 2 of whom became kings. She was a patron of troubadours, a strategist of dynasties, and a woman whose will bent the politics of Europe. By the time William Marshal returned from Jerusalem, Eleanor was entering her later years. Yet her influence still carried the weight of an empire. Eleanor had lived long enough to know the measure of men. She had ridden on crusade with her first husband, Louis VII of France. She had broken free from that union and carried her lands into marriage with Henry II of England, giving him both Aquitaine and a dynasty. She had seen rebellion, betrayal, imprisonment, and triumph. She had faced her own sons on the battlefield, and through it all, she had learned to read loyalty with an instinct sharper than any blade. When she looked at William Marshal, she saw more than a knight of tournaments. She saw the quality most rare at her court: steadiness. William did not dazzle with rhetoric. He did not intoxicate with schemes. His reputation rested not on words, but on endurance. He had survived captivity as a child, risen in tournaments, carried a prince's vow to Jerusalem, and returned, not broken, but tempered. Eleanor recognized in him the one virtue her family's turbulent reigns most desperately needed: trust. And so, Eleanor gave him a gift beyond tournaments, beyond fortune. She arranged his marriage to Isabel de Clare, heiress of one of the greatest fortunes in the realm. Isabel brought with her vast estates in Leinster, Pembroke, and across Ireland and Wales. Overnight, William became not merely a knight of renown, but one of the wealthiest and most powerful lords in England. For many men, such a windfall would have bred arrogance. Castles would rise in ostentation, banquets would overflow in vanity, and coin would pour into hollow indulgence. But William was different. He saw in Isabel not just wealth, but a partner, a chance to root himself in responsibility. He governed his lands with fairness, paid his retainers, strengthened his holdings, and built loyalty among his people. His greatness expanded not in gold, but in the respect he commanded. Eleanor also trusted him with matters of state. During Richard the Lionheart's reign, when the king was absent on crusade or imprisoned abroad, William was among those who steadied the realm. He was not the loudest counselor, but his voice carried weight. When Richard's younger brother John schemed, Eleanor relied on William to temper the chaos with calm counsel. This was the true genius of Eleanor. She placed her trust not in flatterers, but in men who proved their worth through endurance. William did not promise the impossible. He did not bend truth for favor. He gave measured advice, and he kept his word.
In an age when oaths were broken like twigs, that made him invaluable. Eleanor's twilight was shadowed by loss. Richard's death in 1199, John's troubled succession, the constant tug of France against England's continental possessions. Yet through it all, William stood like a pillar. Even when John's tempers raged and barons muttered rebellion, William's presence reminded all that loyalty still existed, that not every man sought advantage from disorder. Chroniclers hint that Eleanor spoke of William with unusual warmth. Perhaps she saw in him a reflection of the constancy she wished for in her sons. Perhaps she recognized in him the steadiness she herself had so often been forced to provide. Whatever the truth, her patronage elevated him beyond what tournaments alone could ever have achieved. By the time of Eleanor's death in 1204, William Marshal was no longer simply the greatest knight. He was one of the realm's most trusted statesmen, a man whose fortune, loyalty, and steadiness made him indispensable. The queen who had once commanded kings left behind not only her dynasty, but the man who would hold it together. Eleanor's story closed in the quiet of Fontevraud Abbey. William's story, however, was far from over. Ahead lay the most dangerous of Plantagenets, King John, and with him a storm that would nearly tear England apart. And when that storm, King John and the Charter. When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, the crown passed to his younger brother John. It was a crown heavy with shadows. England was weary from war, drained by taxes, and unsettled by the shifting balance of power with France. Into this fragile moment stepped a king who was brilliant in calculation, but poisoned by suspicion. Few rulers were as feared by their friends as by their enemies. John was not Richard. He was not the gallant warrior, the crusading hero, the dazzling commander. He was clever, yes, sharp in diplomacy, shrewd in strategy, but his temper burned hot, his paranoia ran deep, and his trust was brittle. Many barons who had followed his brother with pride followed John with hesitation, or not at all. And in this court of suspicion stood William Marshal. William had served Henry II, the young king, and Richard. He had seen tempests, rebellions, betrayals. He knew how fragile crowns could be. But his oath was to the realm as much as to the man who wore it. So when John demanded loyalty, William gave it, not blindly, but faithfully. He did not flatter, nor did he abandon. He stood steady, offering counsel when others offered only fear. Yet John's reign tested even William's patience. The king demanded ever more coin, ever more loyalty, even as his failures mounted. Normandy was lost to the French. His wars drained treasure and blood. His temper alienated allies. And in the silence that followed, rebellion stirred among the barons of England. By 1215, the realm teetered. Barons gathered in defiance, demanding that John acknowledge limits to his power. At a meadow called Runnymede, under the flutter of angry banners, John was forced to the table. There the Magna Carta was sealed, a document that spoke of rights and restrictions, of law above the king, of barons shielded from tyranny. It is easy now to see Magna Carta as the seed of liberty, the ancestor of parliaments and constitutions, but in William's day it was not so romantic. It was a desperate truce, a rope bridge stretched over a collapsing kingdom. John sealed it not because he believed in it, but because he had no choice. William was there. Chroniclers do not place him at the center of the negotiation, nor as the author of its clauses, but his presence mattered.
For if William Marshal, steadfast, loyal, unbending in honor, stood beside the king, then there was hope that the agreement, fragile as it was, might endure. Many doubted John would keep his word. William, ever the realist, knew promises could break. Yet he counseled patience, for even broken promises can leave foundations on which to build.
Picture the scene. The damp air of the Thames, barons in their cloaks muttering oaths, the king, pale with fury, the wax seal pressed into parchment, and amid them William, calm as stone, watching not the quarrel of the hour, but the survival of the realm. Yet, within months, John reneged. Civil war flared. Desperate barons invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. French troops landed, castles fell, and John, sick and weakened, retreated before the storm. In October 1216, death took him, leaving the kingdom in chaos, and his son, Henry, only 9 years old. The question now was not whether Magna Carta would stand. The question was whether England itself would survive. At this moment of peril, barons looked around the realm for a figure of trust. They did not turn to kingship, for the king was a child. They did not turn to princes abroad, for foreign crowns could not command English hearts. They turned, instead, to the one man whose loyalty had endured through sieges, courts, crusades, and charters, firmly. They turned to William Marshal. Regency of England, October 1216. The death of King John left England in turmoil. The French Prince Louis had already landed, welcomed by rebel barons who sought a new ruler. Castles across the realm were divided, loyalties uncertain, and the treasury near empty. And upon the fragile throne of England sat a boy of 9 years old, Henry III. It was not a crown of triumph, but of peril. A child king cannot command armies, nor temper the ambitions of barons. He cannot hold together a land trembling under rebellion. For this, he would need guardians. And so the lords of England turned to the one man whose loyalty had never cracked, whose honor had never bent, whose name carried more weight than any crown. They turned to William Marshal, firmly. William was 70 years old. By the measure of his age, he should have been long retired, resting in prayer or the comfort of family. Yet instead, he was asked to take on the greatest burden of his life, the regency of England. With the boy Henry too young to rule, William would govern in his stead, carrying the fate of the realm on shoulders already weathered by decades of service. He accepted. Not for ambition, he had no need of more land or honor, but because he had always believed in oaths. He had sworn to serve the crown, and though kings had come and gone, the crown itself still needed a protector. His first act was legitimacy. Next came the matter of survival. Prince Louis of France commanded strong forces. Rebel barons marched under foreign banners. The treasury was depleted, soldiers unpaid. But William moved quickly. He secured castles, arranged supplies, and above all, he paid the men who fought. Where John's neglect had sown disloyalty, William's fairness grew confidence. Chroniclers describe him in these years with wonder. Though white-haired and frail in body, when mounted he seemed transformed, still steady in the saddle, still fierce in command. His voice, calm yet firm, steadied men younger than his grandchildren. As regent, William was not only a commander but also a reconciler.
He met with rebellious lords, urging them back to loyalty. He balanced mercy with firmness, punishing betrayal, yet offering forgiveness to those who would return. In council, his words carried unmatched authority, for he had no ambition left but the safety of the realm. His greatest challenge came in 1217, when Louis's forces and rebel barons pressed their claim. England seemed ready to collapse into foreign rule. But William refused despair. He rallied loyalists, reminded them of their oaths, and prepared to stake his own life upon the survival of the boy king. Imagine the sight. An old knight, body bent with age, donning his armor once more, adjusting the straps with hands stiff from years of war. Younger men looked to him with awe. If William Marshal, 70 years old, could still mount his horse and ride into danger, what excuse had they to falter? This regency was not about grandeur, it was about endurance. Every judgment William gave, every coin he spent, every decision he made was aimed not at glory, but at holding together a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Chroniclers call these years his greatest achievement, not the tournaments of his youth, not the cloak carried to Jerusalem, not even the Magna Carta at Runnymede, but the simple, steady guardianship of a child king and a fractured land. Time, however, was not on his side. Each dawn was harder, each campaign heavier. He knew he was nearing his end, yet he gave everything he had left, pouring the last of his strength into England. And in May of 1217, all of that strength would be called upon at Lincoln, where the fate of the kingdom would be decided in battle. William Marshal, the boy once left for dead beneath Newbury's walls, was about to ride one final time into history.
Battle of Lincoln. The spring of 1217 carried with it the weight of England's fate. Prince Louis of France, backed by rebel barons, claimed the crown. Castles across the realm still flew banners of defiance. The boy king Henry III, only 9 years old, could not inspire armies on his own. The kingdom needed more than a child, it needed a symbol. And so once again, William Marshal, 70 years old, mounted his horse. The city of Lincoln had become the hinge upon which the war turned. Its strategic position controlled roads that cut across the heart of England. If it fell, Louis's claim would grow unstoppable. Inside, loyalists clung to the walls. Outside, French and rebel forces pressed with siege engines and fury. William knew there could be no delay. The city must be relieved or the crown was lost. Gathering what forces remained loyal to the boy king, William rode north. His hair was white, his body worn, but his presence was fire. Chroniclers describe him as if age itself bent before his will. Men who might otherwise have faltered drew courage simply from riding at his side. At dawn on the 20th of May, the Royalist army approached Lincoln. Trumpets cut the morning air. The clash was inevitable. William, though regent and statesman, refused to remain in the rear. He armed himself as he had in youth, fastening his mail, adjusting his helm, taking up his lance. Younger knights watched in awe. How could a man of 70 prepare for battle with such calm? "Today we fight," he is said to have declared, "for England, for our young lord, for all that holds us together. Let none forget why we ride." The battle erupted in the narrow streets. Lances shattered, swords rang against shields, war cries echoed from stone walls. Horses thundered through market squares, their hooves striking sparks. Siege engines hurled stones that crashed upon roofs and ramparts. The chaos was total, a storm of iron and flesh. And into this storm rode William Marshal. Chroniclers tell us he led the decisive charge, his lance leveled, his old body firm in the saddle. He struck with such force that rebel lines wavered. Younger men followed, emboldened by his example. The streets became rivers of dust and fear, and the French ranks began to crack. Imagine the sight, an old knight, long past the years of youth, breaking through lines of men half his age. He fought not recklessly but with the wisdom of decades, striking where it mattered, withdrawing when needed, holding the balance of the field. His presence alone carried the weight of inevitability. By midday the battle turned. Rebel forces broke, fleeing in disarray. The siege was lifted, the city saved, and with it the crown of England. Louis's claim crumbled, his baronial supporters scattered. For the boy King Henry III, the day was salvation. For William Marshal, it was the crowning moment of a lifetime of loyalty.
Victory was sweet, but William took no pride in himself. Chroniclers note that he gave thanks to God, not to his own strength. He returned not to feasts or boasts, but to the steady labor of reconciliation, restoring peace, reuniting barons with the crown, ensuring that England could breathe again. Yet all who saw him knew what they had witnessed. The Battle of Lincoln was not just a military victory, it was a symbol that loyalty could outlast treachery, that steadiness could overcome ambition, that even in old age, courage could ride like thunder. For William, it was the last time he would take the field. His body, though still steady in the saddle, carried the toll of decades. He had given England its survival. Soon he would give it his farewell. The streets of Lincoln faded into memory, but the legend endured. The greatest knight had ridden one final charge, and in doing so had saved a kingdom. Ahead lay only the final vigil, where William would lay aside armor for the last time and teach his final lesson, not in battle, but in peace. Every knight, no matter how great, must one day dismount for the last time. For William Marshal, that day came quietly, not in the clamor of battle, but in the silence of age. He had survived more than 70 winters, a span almost unheard of in his century. He had carried swords through tournaments, deserts, and wars. He had raised kings, reconciled barons, saved a kingdom. And now the weight of years pressed harder than any lance. The victory at Lincoln in 1217 had been his last charge. Afterward his strength ebbed. Though he continued to counsel, to guide, to govern as regent, each month grew heavier. His voice softened, his step slowed. Yet his mind remained sharp, his sense of duty unbroken. He knew the end approached, and he prepared for it as carefully as he had prepared for battle. For William, death was not an enemy. It was the final oath to be honored. He summoned his household, his family, his knights. To his sons he gave counsel. Hold fast to your word, for it is the only fortress that never falls. Pay your men fairly, for loyalty bought by justice is greater than loyalty held by fear. Serve the crown with honesty, not ambition. This is the inheritance I give you. Not lands, not gold, but honor. He ordered his debts settled, every coin accounted for, every promise fulfilled. No man was to say that William Marshal left the world owing what he had not repaid. And then, in humility, he asked to be received into the order of... Chroniclers say he retained his humor to the end. When priests urged him to confess his sins, he smiled faintly. God knows them well enough already. Not arrogance, but trust that the life he had lived, imperfect though it was, had been given with sincerity. On May 14, 1219, William Marshal lay upon his bed, candles flickering, prayers murmured around him. His family kept vigil. His knights stood in silence, tears streaking faces hardened by years of war. He whispered his last words, a mixture of gratitude and farewell. And then,
Calmly, he drew his final breath. He was buried in the Temple Church in London, the chosen resting place of Knights of the Temple. His effigy lies there still, a stone figure in armor, hands clasped in prayer, sword at his side. Visitors pass and see only carved stillness. Yet those who know the story feel the weight of a life larger than the stone that marks it. For William Marshal's true monument was not carved in marble. It was carved in loyalty, in promises kept, in a kingdom preserved when all else seemed ready to fall. His final vigil was not simply a death. It was a lesson that greatness is not measured in crowns seized or castles built, but in faith honored, duties fulfilled, and the courage to meet the end with peace. Epilogue: The lamps extinguished. Night falls once more on the long corridors of memory. The lamps grow dim. The voices of the past soften. And yet one name still glimmers like a steady flame against the dark: William Marshal. He was not born to greatness. He was not heir to vast estates, nor chosen by destiny. He was the son of a lesser noble, once handed over as a hostage, dismissed even by his own father as expendable. By all logic, he should have perished before his story began. Yet fate spared him, and in that sparing, history gained its most steadfast guardian. Through the reigns of 4 kings, Henry II, the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and John, he endured. Each tested him differently. He served faithfully, counseled wisely, and fought bravely. And when England's future hung by a thread, he became regent, carrying the burden of a crown he would never wear. Few men in any age have held such power without seizing it. Few could have preserved loyalty through.
His effigy still lies in the Temple Church in London, a knight carved in stone, hands folded in prayer, sword by his side. Centuries have worn smooth the details, but not the memory. To stand before it is to feel the echo of a life lived, not for ambition, but for duty. Close your eyes. Hear the thunder of hooves on distant fields. Hear the clash of steel at Lincoln. Hear the whisper of vows carried to Jerusalem. Then hear the silence of a chamber where an old knight breathed his last with peace. This is William Marshal's true story, not one of conquest, but of loyalty, not of crowns seized, but of crowns preserved. He was called the greatest knight. But perhaps the truest title is this: the most faithful. Let his story be your rest tonight. Let the rhythm of his endurance, his patience, his constancy guide you into calm. Sleep knowing that greatness is not thunder and fire, but the steady flame that refuses to be extinguished. Good night, William Marshal. The lamps are extinguished, but the flame you carried endures.
Thank you for listening to The Sleep of Valor. May this story bring you calm, and may your dreams be guarded by knights of old. Good night.